The day of my husband's funeral, I didn't cry in front of anyone. I stood beside the casket, hands folded, spine straight, listening to condolences that sounded rehearsed. By the next morning, the house was no longer quiet, it was busy. Men I recognized from my father-in-law's office were carrying furniture out through the front door. Not gently. Not carefully. My dining chairs scraped the marble. A lamp I'd chosen cracked at the base. My father-in-law stood in the doorway, black kurta still crisp, voice steady and loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This property reverts to blood family now," he said. "Pack your bags." No paperwork. No discussion. Just a declaration, like my marriage had expired with the funeral rites. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply watched them carry my life out in daylight, while everyone assumed I was too broken to understand what was happening. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something quietly. What do you do when grief is still fresh, but respect is taken anyway? If you're here expecting shouting or scenes, this isn't that kind of story. My name is Brielle, and this is about the moment I realized silence can be mistaken for weakness, and how I let that misunderstanding grow. I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing it because some injustices don't need noise. They need memory, patience, and timing. Before that morning, my life had been orderly in a way that often goes unnoticed, because it works. I was the one who remembered birthdays, scheduled medical appointments, handled paperwork, and kept the house functioning without ever announcing it. Not because anyone asked me to, but because when you step into a family, especially through marriage, you learn quickly what's expected of you. I married into a family that valued appearances. Respectability. Legacy. My husband was the only son, and I was introduced early as the educated one, the calm one, the one who understands how things work. That praise came with invisible duties. I hosted quietly, corrected nothing publicly, and absorbed discomfort without naming it. The house we lived in had always been described as family property. Not his. Not mine. Just family. I paid toward its upkeep. I managed renovations. I organized documents because my husband trusted me with that kind of responsibility. When guests asked questions, I answered. When decisions needed follow-through, I handled it. What I received in return was stability, not warmth, but predictability. I thought that was enough. After my husband's death, people told me to rest, to grieve, to take time. They said I was strong. They said I'd been a good wife. What no one said out loud was that my role had quietly expired. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because the system I'd been supporting had never been built to hold me once I stood alone. I didn't know that yet. But the house did. And so did the people standing inside it that morning. The signs were there even before the funeral, small enough to be dismissed if you were tired or kind, or both. At the hospital, when the doctor asked about insurance details, my father-in-law answered before I could. Not incorrectly. Just conclusively. As if I were an assistant, not the spouse. Later, when relatives gathered, decisions were announced, not discussed. Ritual timings. Guest lists. Even which photo of my husband would be framed. I noticed my name was never attached to any choice. During the funeral rites, someone gently moved me a step back so his father could stand closer to the pyre. No explanation. Just a hand on my elbow and an assumption that I would understand my place. I did understand. I just didn't react. After the ceremony, when people came home, my room door was left slightly open. Not by accident. My wardrobe had been tidied by someone else, my clothes rearranged, my documents stacked too neatly. The house felt supervised. That evening, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. "She's quiet," an aunt said. "She won't create trouble," another replied. "Let things settle. She'll go back to her parents." They spoke as if grief had erased my agency. As if silence meant consent. I didn't interrupt. I didn't announce my presence. I made tea, placed cups on the table, and listened carefully to the assumptions forming around me. Not with anger, but with attention. Because when people believe you're too soft to resist, they stop hiding what they're doing. And that's when patterns begin to reveal themselves. Once the funeral was over, the tone shifted, not abruptly, but confidently. As if a decision had already been made somewhere I wasn't invited to attend. My father-in-law began issuing instructions the way one does when authority is no longer questioned. Movers were scheduled without informing me. The house accountant arrived and sat with him in the living room, files spread out, voices low but unguarded. When I entered, the conversation paused, not out of respect, but impatience. "We'll handle it," he said, waving a hand lightly. "You should rest." Rest had become a convenient word. It meant don't interfere. Neighbors stopped addressing me directly. Questions about the house, the car, the staff, everything was routed past me, as though my presence was ceremonial. At meals, plans were discussed around me. Future renovations. A guest room conversion. Even talk of selling one portion of the land. No one asked what I thought. They assumed I no longer had a stake. What struck me most wasn't cruelty, it was confidence. The confidence of people who believe the law, tradition, and society are quietly on their side. My father-in-law spoke generously in public, telling others he would make arrangements for me. That word again. Arrangements. Temporary. Conditional. Privately, the dismissal sharpened. "This isn't personal, Brielle," he said one evening, not looking up from his phone. "This is just how things work." As if systems operate without choice. As if fairness is automatic. I nodded. I thanked him for his concern. I kept my voice even. Because every time I did, his certainty grew. He spoke more freely. He contradicted himself. Dates changed. Reasons shifted. What began as tradition slowly turned into entitlement. And entitlement, when left unchallenged, always overreaches. They believed I was waiting to be told what would happen to me next. I was doing something else entirely. Silence, when stretched long enough, starts to echo inside you. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering if I had misunderstood the law, the customs, the unspoken rules that seemed to favor everyone but me. Grief has a way of blurring confidence. I questioned myself in ways I never had before. Maybe this was normal. Maybe widowhood came with erasure I hadn't prepared for. Friends called at first. Then less often. They didn't know what to say, and I didn't know how to explain something that hadn't been said outright. When people asked where I would go next, the question itself carried an assumption. Not if I would leave, but when. Even my own parents tread carefully on the phone, choosing their words as if I were fragile glass. "Take care of yourself," they said. "Don't stress." They meant well, but it made me feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person who had lost her husband and her footing. Inside the house, doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when I entered. Staff took instructions from someone else. My name disappeared from daily decisions so quietly it felt intentional. And still, I held my posture. I dressed neatly. I responded politely. I never cried where anyone could see. Not because I was strong, but because I didn't trust the room with my vulnerability. There were moments I nearly spoke up. Moments when the words rose to my throat and hovered there. But something held them back, not fear, but instinct. The same instinct that tells you not to interrupt when someone is revealing too much about themselves. I realized something unsettling. No one was asking me to leave directly. They were waiting for me to volunteer. And that waiting told me more than any confrontation could have. The morning they began moving my things out, it felt final, not dramatic, just efficient. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. My books. My clothes. Even the framed photograph from our wedding day was placed face down, as if it no longer belonged to the present. My father-in-law didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This will make it easier for everyone," he said, watching as a mover sealed a box with tape. "You can collect the rest later." Easier. That word again. Always chosen to sound kind. A relative stood nearby, nodding along. Someone mentioned storage. Someone else asked where I'd be staying. The conversation unfolded as if I'd already agreed. I looked around the house I had managed for years, rooms I had organized, systems I had built, and felt something settle in my chest. Not panic. Not even anger. Just a quiet understanding that this was the moment everyone would later refer to as when she lost everything. I signed a receipt without reading it. I thanked the movers. I didn't protest when my bedroom key was placed on the table, not returned to my hand. From the outside, it must have looked like surrender. People relaxed after that. Voices grew casual. Jokes even surfaced. The tension lifted because the outcome they expected had arrived. No one noticed what I was paying attention to. The dates on the documents. The names on the receipts. The fact that nothing I was asked to sign carried my signature in a legal capacity. They believed the story was over. And that belief made them careless. That evening, after the house grew quieter, I sat on the edge of the bed that was no longer considered mine and let the stillness do its work. I didn't make phone calls. I didn't pack in a hurry. I didn't ask for explanations that would only be half-truths. Instead, I observed. I noticed which rooms had been cleared first. Which items were treated as valuable. Which documents were removed from the study and which were left behind, assumed irrelevant. I memorized the sequence of events the way one memorizes a route, slowly, deliberately. Grief was still there, heavy and present. I missed my husband in a way that had nothing to do with property or power. But grief, I learned, doesn't have to make you blind. It can sharpen you, if you let it. They mistook my calm for collapse. For acceptance. In reality, I was conserving energy. I began writing things down, not accusations, just facts. Dates. Names. Exact phrases used. I kept my tone neutral even on paper, as if I were preparing notes for someone else to read someday. I slept that night without tears. Not because I was healed, but because something inside me had stabilized. I understood now that reacting emotionally would only confirm the version of me they had already decided on. So I did the opposite. I stayed quiet. I stayed present. And I stayed attentive. Because endurance, when it's chosen, is not weakness. It's preparation. The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small repetitions that began to line up when I stopped trying to explain them away. My father-in-law repeated the same sentence to different people, but never in the same way. To neighbors, it was tradition. To relatives, it was legal necessity. To me, it was concern for my future. Each version adjusted depending on the audience. That inconsistency stayed with me. I noticed how quickly decisions were made when I wasn't in the room, and how carefully words were chosen when I was. I noticed how often my husband's name was invoked without reference to his wishes. His voice had been replaced by convenience. One afternoon, I asked a simple question at lunch. Which lawyer is handling the transfer? The table went quiet for half a second too long. Oh, we'll finalize that later, my father-in-law replied smoothly. Later never came. I began recalling older conversations, things my husband had mentioned casually. How he'd insisted on digitizing documents. How he'd once said, half joking, "You're better with details than anyone in this family." At the time, I'd thought it was affection. Now I wondered if it was foresight. Patterns don't shout. They repeat. I realized no one had shown me a will. No one had cited a clause. Everything rested on assumptions spoken with authority but unsupported by evidence. They were relying on speed, shock, and my silence to create reality. That's when confusion gave way to awareness. This wasn't about law yet. It was about control. And control only works when the person being controlled believes there are no alternatives. I stopped asking questions after that. Not because I had answers, but because I now knew what to look for. And once you recognize the pattern, you can step outside it. There was something they didn't know about me, something I'd never needed to announce. I had kept records. Not out of suspicion, but habit. When you manage a household that overlaps with family business, documentation becomes second nature. Utility payments. Renovation invoices. Email threads with contractors. Messages confirming decisions that were later described as family consensus. What my husband's family remembered as informal arrangements were, in many cases, followed up in writing. Quiet confirmations. Shared drives. Cloud folders my husband and I had organized together during a routine document cleanup 2 years earlier. They never asked where those files were stored. They assumed everything important was in the study. In physical folders. In places they could touch. They didn't know about the digital trail. They also didn't know that my husband had once asked me, casually, over dinner, to be listed as the point of contact for certain accounts. Just in case, he'd said. I hadn't thought much of it then. After his death, I accessed those accounts legally, using credentials already in place. I didn't download everything at once. I didn't alert anyone. I reviewed slowly, cross-checking dates against the moments when decisions were now being rewritten. There it was. Property tax receipts paid jointly. Emails where my father-in-law acknowledged my role in managing the house. A message from my husband referencing our home in a context that carried legal weight. Most importantly, there were witness threads, people copied on conversations who were now acting as if they'd forgotten them. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint at what I knew. I simply organized the information into a timeline, labeling each entry with neutral descriptions. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts placed in sequence. Because when the time comes, facts don't need emotion to speak for them. And the people who rely on noise are never prepared for quiet evidence. Once I stopped looking for reassurance, something in me settled. I no longer waited for someone to acknowledge my loss properly or to validate my place in the family. That waiting had been draining me in ways I hadn't recognized until it ended. Grief was still present, but it no longer controlled my reactions. I noticed the change in small things. My posture. My tone. The way I entered rooms without bracing myself for dismissal. I listened more and spoke less, not out of fear, but choice. I stopped explaining myself. When relatives offered unsolicited advice about starting over or moving on, I nodded politely and let their words pass. Their assumptions were no longer something I felt compelled to correct. In fact, their certainty worked in my favor. Inside, I felt calm, not numb, but clear. I began to understand that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's the ability to wait without unraveling. To hold information without rushing to use it. To let others continue performing the roles they've written for themselves. My father-in-law grew more comfortable in my presence again. He mistook my composure for resignation. His instructions became less guarded. He spoke openly about timelines, about how long this phase would last before I was expected to relocate. I listened. I remembered. There was no urge to interrupt or correct him. The need to be seen as reasonable had disappeared. I didn't need to win arguments. I needed accuracy. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt grounded, not because things were fair, but because I understood the terrain. I wasn't standing in the storm anymore. I was mapping it. Preparation, for me, didn't look like confrontation. It looked like alignment. I consulted a lawyer quietly, not to file anything, but to understand the framework I was standing in. I brought no emotional narrative, only documents. I asked questions that began with assuming nothing is said out loud, and if someone relies on custom instead of contract. The answers were measured. Encouraging, but cautious. Enough to confirm that what was happening wasn't automatic, it was being made to look inevitable. I didn't change my behavior at home. I still thanked people. Still complied with requests that didn't compromise me. Still appeared cooperative. But I stopped signing anything that wasn't clearly explained. I asked for copies when I was asked to acknowledge receipt. I kept my tone neutral. I also reached out to two people my husband had trusted, one a family accountant, the other a longtime friend who had been present during earlier property discussions. I didn't ask them to take sides. I asked them to remember. Memory, I learned, is a form of leverage. Every interaction from that point on was treated as a potential record. Not because I intended to weaponize it, but because clarity requires context. My father-in-law became more insistent about timelines. About closure. About moving forward. He believed delay worked against me. He didn't realize delay was exactly what I needed. I waited until everything was in place. Until the documents told a complete story. Until the contrast between what was said publicly and what was done privately became impossible to reconcile. Only then did I agree, calmly, to attend a family meeting he requested. The same living room. The same chairs. He thought it was the final step before my exit. I knew it was the moment the narrative would shift. The living room looked exactly the same as it had the morning my belongings were moved out, except this time, every seat was occupied. Relatives had been called in. An uncle who rarely visited. An aunt who spoke often on behalf of tradition. Even the family accountant was present, seated slightly apart, files resting on his lap. The arrangement wasn't accidental. It was meant to feel official. My father-in-law sat at the head of the room. He spoke first, outlining what he called a clean resolution. His voice carried authority, the kind that assumes agreement before it's given. He explained, again, how property followed bloodlines, how arrangements would be made for my relocation, how this meeting was meant to bring closure. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he looked at me kindly, as if offering a favor. "You understand, Brielle," he said. "This is how these things work." I nodded once. Then I did something unexpected. I thanked him for organizing the meeting, for inviting witnesses, for laying everything out clearly. My tone was calm, almost deferential. It disarmed the room. People relaxed, shifting in their seats, assuming the outcome had already been secured. Only then did I place a slim folder on the table. "I agree that clarity matters," I said quietly. "So I thought it would help if we reviewed a few details together." No accusation. No raised voice. Just an invitation. My father-in-law glanced at the folder, then back at me, unconcerned. He gestured for me to continue. He still believed this was his arena. And that belief, unquestioned, uninterrupted, was exactly what made the next part inevitable. He leaned back in his chair as I opened the folder, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth, the expression of someone confident that whatever comes next cannot touch him. "Before we get into paperwork," he said, waving a hand lightly, "let's not complicate things. Everyone here knows the house was never truly yours." A few heads nodded. Encouraged, he continued. "My son lived here, yes. You manage things, yes. But management is not ownership." He looked around the room, seeking agreement. "Blood establishes rights. That has always been understood." He spoke longer than necessary, repeating himself in different words, each sentence tightening the frame he believed he controlled. In doing so, he filled the room with statements, absolute, declarative, unsupported. I didn't interrupt. He referenced conversations that had never happened. He described intentions my husband had never expressed. He even mentioned a verbal understanding with the accountant sitting across the room. The accountant shifted slightly. Said nothing. And frankly, my father-in-law added, his voice sharpening just a degree, if we hadn't stepped in, things could have become messy. Documents misplaced. Responsibilities neglected. That was the moment. Not because it was insulting, but because it contradicted an email he had written 3 years earlier, thanking me for keeping everything so meticulously recorded. He kept talking. He outlined timelines. He named dates. He declared that I had no claim, no standing, no reason to delay the inevitable. Each sentence landed heavily, intended to close the discussion. Instead, they did the opposite. By the time he finished, the room was silent, not with tension, but with expectation. Everyone was waiting for my response. For emotion. For protest. I closed the folder gently. "Thank you," I said. "That helps." Confusion flickered across his face, for just a second. Because people who overreach never realize they've crossed the line until someone quietly marks it. And I had just let him draw it himself. I opened the first page of the folder. The room leaned in, not to hear me speak, but because the weight of documents in someone's hand naturally draws attention. "Here," I said, "are copies of emails, receipts, and confirmations dating back years. Every payment made on this property. Every maintenance decision. Every acknowledgement from every office involved. All verified." I let the words settle. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. My father-in-law's confidence faltered, just slightly, when the accountant recognized a few familiar threads. Names. Dates. Signatures. Facts no one could dispute. I also included a timeline, I continued, showing when each action was taken, by whom, and under whose authority. This shows the difference between tradition and documentation, intention and execution. A murmur ran through the room. Some relatives exchanged glances. The aunt who always spoke first cleared her throat. I placed the final sheet on the table. A single email from my late husband appeared on top. "Brielle is to handle all house matters. Trust her judgment entirely." The words were simple. But they carried the weight of authority, intention, and foresight. I looked around the room calmly. "I'm not disputing tradition," I said softly. "I'm only showing what is legally and factually present. Everything else," I gestured to the father-in-law, "has already been handled. According to the agreements that existed before anyone here assumed control." The room went still. No one spoke. My father-in-law swallowed, a flash of disbelief passing over his face. For years, he had relied on noise, assumptions, and my silence. He had built his plan on the belief that I would crumble. That I would accept the narrative he created. But the truth doesn't need volume. It doesn't need rage. It only needs to be undeniable. And in that room, in that exact moment, the undeniable spoke louder than anyone's authority ever could. The reaction was quiet at first. Not because people were composed, but because they were processing a truth they had ignored for years. My father-in-law sat frozen, hands gripping the arms of his chair. The smirk that had accompanied his morning declarations was gone. The room, once filled with murmurs of agreement, now hummed with disbelief. The accountant shuffled papers, realizing that what had been presented to him as informal arrangements were, in fact, meticulously documented legal facts. A cousin who had nodded along with every claim earlier now stared at the timeline in silence. Even the aunt, who prided herself on controlling family narratives, said nothing. No one needed me to point out mistakes. They had revealed them themselves, through words, through arrogance, through overconfidence. What? How? My father-in-law finally managed, his voice tight. I didn't answer with argument. I didn't raise my voice. I simply gestured to the folder, letting the evidence speak. This is why, I said quietly, preparation matters more than assertion. Every eye in the room followed the documents, cross-referencing memories with written facts. Their assumed control collapsed under the weight of precision, clarity, and timing. I had never shouted, never demanded, never dramatized. Yet the public undoing was complete. Their authority had evaporated in the presence of truth. Relatives whispered, some apologized quietly, some realized for the first time the error of their assumptions. My father-in-law sank back into his chair, a faint flush on his face, no words left to reclaim. I had not humiliated them. I had only shown the power of restraint. And in that silence, justice, earned, undeniable, irreversible, had been served. In the days that followed, the shift in the household was subtle but absolute. My father-in-law no longer spoke over me, no longer assumed control of decisions I had always handled. The relatives who had aligned themselves with him became cautious, measured in their words, aware that authority alone no longer dictated outcomes. The property remained intact under my management, recognized legally and socially. People who had once treated me as a guest in my own home now deferred to my judgment. Staff, neighbors, even extended family began addressing me by name and title with a respect that felt quietly earned, not demanded. Some relationships fractured quietly, those who had relied solely on privilege rather than principle stepped back. Others strengthened, drawn to fairness and consistency. The house itself, once a symbol of displacement and disregard, regained its warmth, framed now by order, acknowledgement, and rightful stewardship. I moved through the rooms with a calm confidence that had been absent before, tracing the spaces I had preserved and documented. Each item, each file, each corner represented not just ownership, but careful attention and measured restraint. Grief remained, but it no longer dictated the terms of my life. I had endured, observed, and leveraged circumstances not through confrontation but through quiet intelligence. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a lightness, subtle, unspoken, undeniable. Looking back, I realized that dignity is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not compete with arrogance or entitlement. What I had gained was not revenge in the traditional sense. It was far more enduring. Recognition, respect, and the quiet restoration of what was rightfully mine. My power was never in confrontation, it was in patience, observation, and meticulous preparation. I had been underestimated because I grieved silently. I had been overlooked because I did not protest immediately. But in choosing restraint over reaction, in documenting rather than disputing, I had rewritten the narrative entirely. Lessons remained. Systems favor the loud, but truth favors the prepared. Authority can be claimed temporarily, but evidence, consistency, and clarity are permanent. And when justice is earned quietly, it resonates far beyond the walls where it first unfolded. In the end, I walked through the house with calm certainty, knowing that the story, my story, was no longer dictated by the assumptions of others. I had survived. I had observed. I had prevailed. And in that quiet triumph, dignity won.